think to begin with, it might be helpful just to give you a slight warning. When David Blunkett was speaking in the House of Lords on the Identity Documents Bill at its second reading, he named me and Phil Booth and essentially said, well, we run a very good campaign. In fact, we managed to fool all the people all the time, including the media and every concerned citizen about what was being proposed with identity cards, and it was completely different to what the government was, of course, intending. So I'm going to fool you for the next 5 or 6 minutes. Coming from LSE, we have, I think, the highest proportion of international students in the UK and one of the highest proportions of international staff in the UK. So in many, many ways, LSE is an exception. It's also one of the more high-rated institutions, so the students generally come there because they want to study. LSE has always been a place that monitors class attendance, and it does that for all students. It doesn't pick up and differentiate between foreign nationals versus home EU students. Even when I was an undergraduate, the point was that if you failed to show up for 2 classes on a trot, we're just concerned that you haven't fallen in a ditch somewhere or collapsed outside the nightclub and have passed away. So there's always been that sense. Now, whether that's purely pastoral or whether that's also tied in with the academic side of things, because obviously if you're failing to attend classes, there's probably other things going on in your life, which might be financial, might be personal, etc. So separating out the pedagogical element and the pastoral element is not necessarily quite such a clear-cut thing. In terms of the LSE Identity Project, when the Identity Cards Bill was first being proposed, we had the sense that the way it was being presented, the way it was being discussed, was failing to address many of the concerns, questions, different viewpoints that many of the people that we were interacting with were raising. For example, the scheme for identity cards for UK nationals was based around a centralized database where every time your identity would be checked, an audit record would be stored on the centralized database. And we knew from commercial organizations, for example, Microsoft, that when Microsoft had introduced this really nice feature called Microsoft Passport, whereby they would keep hold of all of your logon details, so you just have to log on to Microsoft Passport, and then they would log you onto every single website, a centralized, secure, single point of identity information. They realized that this was pretty problematic for them. One, because it became a single point of failure. If Microsoft Passport wasn't working, you couldn't log on to any of your other systems. And it also raised real risks because they would know exactly which websites you were logging on to, which could either be commercially exploited or give people concerns that it would be commercially exploited by that. So Microsoft very early on realized that centralized databases, centralized stores are not necessarily the way forward. And it was these kinds of, well, why are they trying to do it this way, that led to the basis for much of the research that was going on. And one of the particular things that we picked up on was the fact that the design, the specifications for the identity cards for UK nationals were being pushed over and above the requirements that were actually there on the UK government. So they were saying, well, we need to introduce fingerprinting for British passports, so we might as well also do fingerprinting for identity cards. Except that the UK doesn't need to have fingerprints on passports because it's not part of the Schengen agreement. Schengen is that area, it's mainland Europe where you can travel across borders. Schengen have agreed that you should have fingerprints on your travel documents to allow for that. The UK is not required to do that, but it chose to do that, but kept saying, well, we have to because Europe is telling us, rather than we want to. And there's a very different political argument about whether or not that's a good thing to do for potentially enhancing the integrity of the passport document. So there's this theme of over and above the requirements that are actually imposed on governments. Second thing that you need to be very clear about is that the identity cards that are being scrapped are the identity cards for UK nationals with a version for EU nationals. The foreign nationals identity card isn't an identity card in the same way. It's certainly covered by a completely different piece of legislation. It's run by a different government department. There is some sharing of technology solutions, or there was some sharing of technology solutions. And previous government made a lot of saying that it's an identity card for foreigners, just like the one that's going to be coming for the UK nationals. So look, we've got one that's working for foreign nationals. It'll be just like that for UK nationals as well. And so they were trying to merge the two together, but in one way of looking at just the foreign nationals identity card is it's just a slightly more portable version of the sticker that was stuck onto the passport anyway. There's an extra element with the biometrics, which I'll come to in a second, but essentially it was the same visa requirement document, just in the form of a plastic card rather than something that you had stuck into your passport. But when you come to look at the exact details of what was required, once again, the UK government was going for this over and above what's actually required in the formal requirements. The House of Commons European Scrutiny Committee looked into this, and they got a nice letter from the then Home Office Minister Liam Byrne, who said, based on our current thinking, a biometric residence permit, which was a more accurate description of what actually is involved, the BRP solution that implements only the minimum required to meet EU regulations. So there's a certain requirement that the EU does impose on the UK, will have startup costs of approximately 36 million. The preferred solution that includes additional features over and above that required to meet the EU regulation has estimated setup costs of approximately 60 million, so £24 million over the minimum that's required. So then they were asking, well, what benefits do you get by going to this higher level of residence permit? Well, the first benefit is wonderfully out of date, contribution to the wider national identity scheme. The long-term plan was to integrate many of the mechanisms for UK identity cards and foreign national identity documents. So by having the same high-level capabilities for foreign nationals, you could potentially get cost savings later on. The fact that the UK cards have been scrapped kind of chops a huge chunk of that element out of the argument. Benefit 2, improvement to immigration control. Whilst the EU proposal for a uniform format biometric residence permit will help simplify immigration control, the EU regulation does not stipulate any controls related to ensuring that recorded biometrics are unique. So there's one thing saying the person whose card this is has these fingerprints, and we can do a one-to-one match to say that the person in front of us has the fingerprint that matches the one that's on the card. That's very different to having a database of all of the fingerprints that you can check to make sure that those fingerprints haven't been entered previously. And then the third one's really ironic. Benefit 3, compliance with EU regulation. By doing this, we'll prove that we're better at implementing EU regulations than the rest of Europe. So that's a great benefit for spending £24 million over the minimal option. So when you're looking at these things, you need to look at what's actually required, because there's one political fight in terms of what are the requirements at the EU level for biometric residence permits for foreign nationals. And then there's a second question of, well, what is the UK government, or has the previous UK government chosen to implement to address those, and what's the mismatch between the two? And I'll stop at that point.